Welcome to part 2 of our deep dive on Dungeons & Dragons and how it became cool again. I'm Melody, you're watching Melody Ever After. If you're returning from part 1, cool. If you're not and you haven't seen that, go check it out, or not, I don't care. But this is going to pick up right where we left off, right after the release of the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Last week we looked at how D&D became popular in the 70s, how it progressed through the 80s, caused satanic panic in the 80s and 90s, and then eventually fizzled out in the 2000s.
Which brings us to the entire reason that D&D is back in fashion. And it all started with the cringiest year of all time. The year was 2014. The 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons was just released. The game was new, fresh, and a lot of restrictions from the previous editions that made the game boring were revised. 5e was about exploration, expression, and roleplay above anything else. Complicated things like prestige classes were now simplified into what were called subclasses. Character options that used to be confusing were now streamlined to preserve their essence while becoming easier to use and more fun to play. Probably most importantly, the sensationalization of online art on platforms like Tumblr, DeviantArt, and Instagram. More people focused into the flavoring of their own original characters and how they roleplayed them. They were able to display these character traits through character art, and with the improvement of online shopping, cosplaying their own characters and commissioning this character art was easier and more accessible than ever, and it looked better too. Speaking of the internet, there was also a third thing that propelled the success of what we currently know as Dungeons & Dragons, and that was the online behavior at the time. Websites like Tumblr, Pinterest, and Twitter were fueled by popular television shows, books, and movies. Shows like New Girl and Big Bang Theory encouraged their audience that being nerdy and quirky made you different and exciting instead of lame and boring like it would have made you in the 2000s. Books like The Hunger Games, Harry Potter, Divergent, and Twilight made reading a cool and unique hobby to have. And people use these online platforms like Tumblr and Twitter to talk about fan theories, make fan art, make fan fiction, and sell handmade merch inspired by their favorite media. Shows like Doctor Who, Supernatural, and Sherlock got huge followings by teenage girls and teenage guys alike on these sites. Being a nerd was officially quirky. Thus, the Super Hulock era of the internet was born. Coincidentally, the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons came out during the Ermagerd era of the internet, and its new robust character design mechanics encouraged even new players to get really creative when it came to building a character, even taking inspiration from books, movies, and shows of the time. People loved making characters in D&D inspired by their favorite pop culture icons. Many players went on to design their own in-game races, classes, and monsters inspired by their favorite books and movies. This was called homebrew. It was like being able to have a Time Lord in Dungeons & Dragons, or have your character speak Parseltongue. Homebrew has always been around, but I think it really took off in 5e because of 5e's open gaming license. This allowed creators to sell their homebrew on the DM's Guild, or independent sites like Patreon for profit. Homebrew is so popular now that many homebrew races, classes, and settings have been adopted by Dungeons & Dragons into official material for the game. 2014 was a great year for D&D, but even though nerd culture was cute and quirky, it still didn't mean that it was 100% mainstream like it is today. That didn't happen until 2016. Okay, no. Stranger Things was not the only thing. It was not the sole factor that made D&D popular again. That would be a crazy thing to propose. Matt Mercer created a podcast called Critical Role in 2015, and by 2016 it really took off on podcast websites as well as on YouTube. Races and setting created by Mercer's campaign were adopted into the game's official materials, and the podcast had so many fans that they were able to crowdfund 2 fully animated seasons of their campaign in the style of Avatar: The Last Airbender, known as Vox Machina. Even College Humor got into the action. In case you didn't know, College Humor is that group that you find when you scroll on Facebook Reels for like an unnecessarily long amount of time on the toilet. Brittany Lee Mulligan was the Dungeon Master of Dimension 20, which has thousands of fans as well. But the one thing that really set Dungeons & Dragons ablaze in the eyes of mainstream culture, in my opinion, was Stranger Things. Everybody knows what Stranger Things is. I'm not gonna go elaborate on Stranger Things and explain the whole 4 seasons that are out. Everybody has seen Stranger Things. The Duffer Brothers' work of Netflix genius opened the eyes of cool, popular people everywhere. Because Stranger Things was cool, the game that they reference in Stranger Things, Dungeons & Dragons, made the game cool by default. 2016 was the year that a Stranger Things box set of D&D starter kit hit the shelves at Barnes & Noble, and these unicorn frappuccino, hydro flask toting, scrunchy wearing girlies lost their ever-loving noggins. Soon, playing D&D was cool again, as well as obnoxious mom jeans, Kylie Jenner lip kits, and big-ass eyebrows. Oh my god, those eyebrows! I have a theory that because Stranger Things had such a long stretch from 2016 to 2023, as long as they keep referencing Dungeons & Dragons in the show, it will continue to be popular. That's because we don't really have a satanic panic crowd that really cares about what the youth plays these days. Satanic panic right now is more about wondering why Doja Cat shaved her head or chugging shots of ivermectin when you get a cold. But seriously, I cannot go anywhere without seeing Dungeons & Dragons now. From the grocery store clerk who bagged my groceries a couple months ago who had the D20 drinking tumbler, to Target selling officially licensed Dungeons & Dragons dice as well as source books, to the nerds gummy clusters that were inspired by mimics from Dungeons & Dragons, to the Dungeons & Dragons movie that we watched last summer. I see that stuff everywhere. I just feel like it's more relevant than ever. There's a good chance that if you tell someone, hey, I play Dungeons & Dragons, they'll say, oh cool, I play D&D too, or they'll say, oh, my daughter plays that. Everyone knows someone who plays D&D, and that is definitely not how it was when I was growing up. I'd like to think that the world has become a little bit kinder, and the nerdy kids are no longer the butt of anyone's joke. I'd like to think that cool kids everywhere have opened their minds to nerdy and geeky culture. But I really think that the internet and pop culture have just kind of temporarily propelled Dungeons & Dragons to the point of being borderline cool due to it frequently appearing in movies, shows, books, and video games. But whatever the case, I'm really glad that Dungeons & Dragons has come to the surface in the sea of relevancy. It's a fun way to hang out with my friends and disconnect from my devices, and gives us a creative outlet to share ideas and stories, because people are storytelling animals. We've told stories since the dawn of time, and Dungeons & Dragons is such a cool, therapeutic, and fun way to tell stories. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. When did you notice Dungeons & Dragons getting more popular? Has it been here the whole time? Am I just, like, crazy? Probably. You've been watching Melody Ever After. Until next time.